Hey, Humber U of GH, my name is Gabby and I am here with the multi-talented and multifaceted multimedia master, Margaret Cho. We're going to be talking about queer representation in media, the joy of pride, and how you can usher acceptance into your own community. You have kind of done it all when it comes to entertainment. You have a podcast and you've done film and television, you've released music, stand-up, and you also grew up in a markedly queer area of San Francisco. So that kind of got me thinking, since performance is such kind of a pivotal aspect of queer culture, both popularly and theoretically, did your childhood influence your approach to being on stage?
Oh, yes. I mean, also, I was in my earliest incarnation as a comedian doing a lot of AIDS fundraising, doing a lot of shows in gay bars. So there was so much queerness that informed my performance that was really about kind of like trying to imitate the drag queens, trying to imitate the gay comedians that I was meeting in these different gay bars, and starting up as a sort of queer kid. It was really important. Like, it was a really great culture to be privy to, and it helped me learn so much more about performance, because queer performance is really about the way that we understand ourselves, because we're seeing ourselves and we're seeing ourselves reflected back. And so it's really it's a powerful tool. So I got a lot from my upbringing.
Yeah, for sure. I like that you mentioned it's a way to like understand yourself better when you're not kind of given the tools from other places. And with that said, what types of stories would you like to see more of featuring queer Asian characters in the coming decade, especially given the uptick in anti-Asian hate crimes that has occurred since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I would like to see more stories that are less about identity and more about stories, and that identity is part of the narrative, but it's not the entirety of it. I think that there's just so much room to grow. We need more trans stories. We need more just different kinds of experiences that have identity as background, but not as the entirety of it.
Right, like no one character can represent an entire community, just like no one person can. So like there needs to be like, just because someone shares your identities doesn't necessarily mean you'll relate to them. So you definitely have to like hear different perspectives and stuff like that. And it kind of also brings to mind how the queer community is sometimes kind of like misrepresented as this place that is just universally accepting, or where everyone always feels universally accepted. And unfortunately, that's still not the case in 2021. There's still a lot of like gatekeeping, especially as it comes to kind of who is considered, queer enough. And you've spoken before about having to kind of prove to other people that you are in fact bisexual. So how do you balance like talking about your sexuality in your material without kind of feeling like you have to prove something?
It's hard because there's like a need to want to represent, but at the same time, you're just telling your truth. So it's more about understanding like how young people are talking about their gender fluidity, different ways of identifying in terms of like the non-binary. Like, there's so many different ways now to represent and be yourself. And so we're getting to a place where people are less about so much like trying to put labels on it than to like release ourselves from it, which I think labels actually can be helpful when you're talking about politics, especially when you juxtapose it with the mainstream world or the conservative world. So there's ways where we can look to uniting, though, that I think are really important.
Yeah, I definitely agree that like some people really identify with labels and like find freedom in that, but they can also at the same time be like the very thing that they sought to eliminate. And kind of on the same note, what do you think is the importance of like believing people when they tell you who they are?
I think you have to believe people, because why would you have an ulterior motive in explaining your being? There shouldn't be. So I don't want to be so jaded as to think that people are trying to be something in order to get something. I think that's weird. So I think it's more about listening and active listening. I think it's really about listening and understanding.
What would you say to a fellow queer person who feels like they aren't accepted in the queer community?
Well, I mean, that to know that that's also possible because we're learning so much and we're learning much faster. And that we let our internalized biases keep us from being together for a long time. You know, there was a time in the gay community where the lesbians and the gay men were not on the same side, which is really odd to think about because, you know, now we seem to have so much of a united community, but there's still areas where we fight bias. There's still areas where we see there's problems. And so it's really about explaining that and knowing that if you feel something's off, it is, and to explain your position in a way that makes sense to you and to everybody else.
What advice would you give to someone who has never celebrated Pride but wants to start? Like, what are some ways they could get involved?
I think there's so many virtual celebrations happening that you can get online and be a part of. Also, when the world opens back up, just go, you know, just see. There's so much to see. And one of the things that's been really hard about the pandemic is not being able to engage in Pride in person, but we have so much of an ability to connect globally for Pride online, which I think is really, really, really amazing.
Yeah, I always wonder, like, there's been so much comparison between like this current pandemic and the pandemic that happened in like 1918, I think, the flu one. And I'm like, how did they do it without the internet? Like, how? I don't understand.
You know, it reminds me a lot, the pandemic actually does remind me a lot of AIDS. It's really interesting how this pandemic actually has so much more to do with the way that we are sort of blaming a community, or there's a lot of blame towards the Asian community around this, and there's so much blame to the gay community around AIDS. And so there's so many different parallels. So I see, and we did it without the internet then. We had a little bit of internet, but not like we do now.
Just coming back to Pride, why in your view is queer culture kind of just not only an important thing, but also like a joyous thing to get to celebrate?
Because it's a way to come to terms with really understanding our true selves and understanding the changing nature of ourselves. And queerness is such a huge part of humanity. And yet we've been relegated to these oppressed areas in so many ways for such a long time. And finally to have a global awareness, and it's actually not all over the globe where queerness is accepted. So there's still a lot to do, but that we can celebrate is really powerful. So I'm just grateful that I'm alive to see this kind of Pride celebration happening everywhere, and we have to continue it.
That's all the questions that I have lined up for you today. But before I let you go, I did want to open up the floor and just ask if there's anything that I didn't mention today that you wanted to touch on. You can plug any upcoming projects or anything like that.
Well, I have a podcast called The Margaret Cho Mortal Minority. And this season we talk about modern Asian American hate crimes juxtaposed with historical Asian hate crimes and crimes by Asian Americans. So it's a very interesting look at all of the history that we're not taught in school. And so I'm really excited to do that.
Once again, Margaret, thank you so much for joining us today. You've offered such an adept perspective on these topics, and I just feel so blessed that you were able to come and sit down with us and celebrate Pride. So on behalf of Ignite, happy Pride. Everyone, go stream The Margaret Cho wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow @ShareIgnite on Twitter and Instagram for all things student life.